He threw $1 at me, at my own wedding, and he laughed like he'd just told the cleverest joke in the room. I didn't cry. That's the part people always expect me to say. That I burst into tears or ran out of the hall. I didn't. I stood there holding a bouquet of white lisianthus, or maybe they were spray roses. No, they were lisianthus. I remember the thin green stems bending against my palm, and I watched the dollar bill drift down and land near the hem of my dress. It was a rented dress. Off-white, not bridal white. Let me take you back a few minutes. Before that moment, because context matters. It always does. The venue was a converted community art hall on the east side of the city. Exposed brick, folding wooden chairs. My cousin's friend handled the sound system, and it hummed faintly every time someone adjusted the microphone. There were about 50 guests, maybe 52. I kept counting because I was nervous. The cake sat on a round table that wobbled if you leaned on it too hard. It wasn't a cheap wedding, but it wasn't extravagant either, and that mattered to him. When my ex-husband walked in, he didn't look surprised. He looked entertained. That's worse. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than our entire reception budget. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room slowly, like a critic evaluating a small-town theater production. I saw two of my aunts whisper to each other. My maid of honor stiffened beside me. I had not invited him. Someone had told him. Or he'd found out through social media. Or, actually, no, it wasn't social media. I hadn't posted anything publicly. It must have been through work connections. He had a way of keeping himself informed about things that weren't his business anymore. He caught my eye across the room, and he smiled. You know that smile. The one that doesn't reach the eyes. The one that says, I still own part of you. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had someone from your past show up somewhere they absolutely did not belong? Not to reconnect, not to apologize, just to measure you. I'd be curious to know how you handled it, because I didn't handle it the way I imagined I would. Back then, 5 years earlier, I had believed I married a man who valued ambition. What I didn't understand was that he only valued it when it was his, but that's ahead of the story. That afternoon before the ceremony, I stood in a small side room that smelled faintly of acrylic paint and dust. My new husband, Daniel, had squeezed my hands and said, Whatever happens today, we're steady. We're steady. I didn't know yet how literal that would become. When the officiant began speaking, I felt calm, not giddy, not breathless, just anchored. The air conditioner clicked on halfway through the vows and blew cool air against my shoulders. I remember thinking how ordinary it all felt. In a good way. Then came the laughter. Not loud at first. A short, sharp exhale from the back row. I didn't turn immediately. I knew the sound. He stood up before the officiant had even finished the sentence. Slow clap, 1, 2, 3. Each one spaced just enough apart to demand attention. Guess the alimony wasn't enough for a real venue, he said. Some people gasped. Someone dropped a fork, and then the dollar. He flicked it toward me like a tip left on a diner table. In that suspended second, I felt something unexpected. Not humiliation, not rage, clarity. Because I realized he hadn't come to mock the wedding. He had come to remind me who he believed I still was. What he didn't understand, what none of us in that room understood yet, was that he had just miscalculated in front of the wrong man, and Daniel was already standing. Before that day, before the dollar, before the laugh, my life had settled into something quiet. Not flashy, not fragile either, just structured. After the divorce, I moved into a 2-bedroom condo on the north side of the city. 3rd floor, balcony facing a parking lot with a single stubborn maple tree that dropped leaves into the same corner every fall. I used to sweep them into a neat pile with a broom that shed its own bristles. There was comfort in that routine. Small, repetitive tasks, nothing dramatic. The walls were a soft gray, or maybe they were called mist. The paint can had some poetic name I can't remember now. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I chose it myself. The kitchen cabinets didn't close properly unless you nudged them with your hip. The refrigerator hummed louder than necessary at night. I slept. With a white noise machine anyway, so I didn't mind. The space felt earned, not gifted. Daniel came into my life 2 years after the divorce. We met at a zoning board meeting. I was presenting a redevelopment proposal. Nothing glamorous, just a small mixed-use renovation project. He sat in the back row, sleeves rolled up, listening without interrupting. Afterward, he asked one question. It wasn't about profit margins or tax incentives. It was about community parking access. That caught my attention. Now, I didn't know then that he owned half the commercial real estate in 3 neighboring districts. I learned that later, slowly. He didn't lead with it. In fact, when someone mentioned his last name during our 3rd date, I thought they were confusing him with someone else. They weren't. But Daniel never performed wealth. He drove a 5-year-old SUV, wore the same leather watch every day, paid attention when I spoke. That was the part that mattered to me, and I need to say this carefully because hindsight can rewrite memory. But at the time, I truly believed I had learned from my first marriage. I thought I had developed a radar for arrogance. I was wrong. Before. I didn't think I could be wrong again. My ex-husband, Marcus, had built his identity around optics. Business class flights, tailored suits, charity galas where the lighting was soft and the wine glasses were thin enough to flex. Our home back then had marble floors that echoed when you walked across them. I used to tiptoe at night because the sound felt intrusive. With Daniel, there was no echo. We cooked together. He chopped vegetables unevenly, left the stems on sometimes. Once, he burned garlic so badly the smoke alarm went off and we both stood there waving dish towels like frantic birds. He laughed at himself. Marcus never laughed at himself. That should have been my first red flag back in the marriage. The absence of self-awareness. But no, that's not accurate. The first red flag was smaller, subtler. He used to correct my stories at dinner parties, not aggressively, just slight adjustments. It was actually 2012, not 2013. Or, it wasn't her idea. It was the firm's. I'd feel my sentence shrink midair. I told myself he was detail-oriented. Detail-oriented. That's what I called it. Have you ever renamed someone's flaw so it feels easier to live with? I'm asking honestly, because I did that for years. I'd like to know if I'm alone in that, or if others have sanded down sharp edges in their memory just to keep peace. When Marcus and I divorced, it wasn't explosive. No screaming in courtrooms, no public scandals. It was colder than that. Negotiated, calculated. He insisted on certain assets. I insisted on walking away without dragging the process through the mud. He kept the house. I kept my name. At the time, I told myself that was enough. There was one small thing, though, something I brushed aside. After the divorce finalized, he sent me a single text message. "You'll miss the lifestyle," no punctuation. Just that. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. I told myself he was projecting. I told myself he needed to believe that. But some part of me, and I hate admitting this, wondered if he was right. That question lingered quietly during the first year I dated Daniel. Not loudly, just a faint hum under the surface. When Daniel suggested we keep the wedding small, I agreed immediately. It felt aligned with who we were. Still, there was a moment, and this is embarrassing, when I looked at reception venues online and compared square footage. Not because I wanted bigger, just to measure what? I'm not even sure now. Security, maybe? Daniel noticed me staring at the laptop one night. He didn't ask what I was comparing. He simply closed it gently and said, "I don't need to impress ghosts." I laughed then. Thought it was poetic. I didn't realize how literal that sentence would become. In the months leading up to the wedding, everything felt steady. Invitations printed on textured cream cardstock. My sister helped address envelopes at the dining table. We argued about the font size for about 10 minutes. No, maybe it was 20. She wanted bold. I wanted understated. Understated one. There were no luxury planners. No floral arches flown in from overseas. Just local vendors. People we could look in the eye. I believed that choosing simplicity meant choosing freedom, and I believed Marcus was finished being part of my story. That was my mistake, because stability can feel permanent right up until the moment it's tested, and when that door opened at the back of the hall, I realized I had underestimated the kind of man he still was. When the door opened at the back of the hall, I didn't turn right away. It was the draft that caught my attention first. A thin ribbon of cool air slid along the back of my neck, lifting the fine hairs there. The ceremony had already started. The officiant was halfway through a sentence about partnership and shared seasons. Chairs creaked softly as people shifted. Then the hinges made that low metallic sigh. I told myself it was just another guest running late. But late guests don't pause in doorways. I felt it before I saw it. That subtle change in the room's temperature when attention redirects. A ripple. My maid of honor's fingers tightened around her bouquet. Daniel's thumb brushed lightly against my knuckles. Just once. I turned. Marcus stood there, framed by the open door like he'd timed his entrance. Not rushed, not hesitant. Measured. He scanned the space slowly, eyes moving from the exposed brick walls to the folding chairs to the modest floral arrangements. Inventory. He wasn't smiling yet. That came a second later. Or maybe 2 seconds. It felt stretched. I remember thinking, he looks exactly the same. But that's not true. His hair was shorter, and there was more gray at the temples. I didn't notice that until later, when everything replayed in my mind like slow-motion footage. In the moment, all I saw was posture, upright, relaxed, comfortable, like he belonged there. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion. How did he know? We hadn't shared mutual friends in years. I'd been careful in a way that felt almost paranoid at times. No public announcements, no shared event pages. Invitations mailed quietly. Unless I stopped that thought. I didn't want suspicion on my wedding day. Not yet. He moved down the aisle toward an empty seat in the back row. Shoes polished to a high shine. Each step deliberate, not apologetic. A few guests glanced over their shoulders. Someone whispered his name. Not loudly, but enough that I heard it. Daniel leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "Do you want to pause?" His voice was steady, low, no tension in it. I shook my head. "No," I said, and my voice surprised me. It didn't tremble. The officiant continued, though I noticed her pace quicken just slightly. Or maybe I imagined that. Memory does that. Adjusts tempo to match emotion. I can't be certain now. Marcus sat, crossed one leg over the other, folded his hands, and watched, not with sadness, not with regret, with assessment. That's when the unease started, a thin thread pulling somewhere beneath my ribs. Because this wasn't impulsive. He hadn't stumbled in accidentally. He'd chosen this moment, chosen to be seen. The vows resumed. I tried to focus on Daniel's voice as he spoke. He promised patience. He promised partnership. He promised to argue fair and forgive fast. That line stuck with me. Argue fair. Marcus shifted in his seat. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A small smirk, almost amused. Then I noticed something else. His phone was in his hand, not raised. Not recording, just resting there, screen dark. Why bring it out at all? A prickle ran up my spine. Because Marcus never did anything without purpose. He curated impressions the way some people curate art collections, carefully, strategically. Was he planning to post something? To document the cheap venue? To send photos to mutual business contacts? I hated that my mind went there. But it did. And here's where the fork happened. Not dramatically. Not with music swelling in this background. Just quietly inside my own head. Do I stop this ceremony and confront him? Or do I trust that he'll behave like an adult in a public room? I waited in seconds. If I confronted him, I'd give him exactly what he might want. Attention. A scene. Proof that he still had access to my emotional center. If I ignored him, I risked whatever performance he might be planning. Trust or verify, observe or intervene. I chose observation, not because I was fearless, not because I was certain, because I wanted to see what he would reveal when he believed I wasn't reacting. So, I faced forward again, focused on Daniel, on the cadence of his breathing, on the faint hum of the sound system. Behind me, Marcus shifted again, and I felt, with a clarity that tightened my throat just slightly, that this wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was premeditated. The officiant asked if anyone objected. There was a pause. A long one. Longer than usual, and in that space, in that thin slice of silence, I heard Marcus inhale. Not loudly, but intentionally. And I realized he hadn't come to watch. He had come to participate. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the silence didn't feel ceremonial. It felt loaded. Marcus didn't speak right away. That's the part people assume, that he jumped up dramatically. He didn't. He let the quiet stretch, long enough for a few guests to glance back, long enough for the air conditioner to click off, leaving the room strangely still. Then he stood, slowly. "I just want to make sure," he said, voice smooth, "that everyone here understands what they're investing in." A few nervous laughs, scattered across the room. Not many. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Marcus had always preferred controlled volume. It made people lean in. Daniel's hand tightened around mine, not painfully, just firm, grounded. The officiant blinked, clearly unsure whether this was a joke. "Sir, this isn't the time." "Oh, I disagree," Marcus interrupted gently. "Timing is everything." There it was, that same polished tone he used in boardrooms, the one that made even criticism sound reasonable. I felt my stomach shift, not drop, exactly. More like something rearranging internally, because I recognized the strategy, public setting, plausible civility, undercut the target without raising his voice. He took a few steps down the aisle, shoes clicking against the concrete floor. "Kimura has always appreciated aesthetics," he continued, gesturing lightly at the room. "Though I suppose budgets change." There were murmurs now. My sister whispered something sharp under her breath. I didn't catch it. I kept my posture still. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. That was when I realized this wasn't improvisation. He had props. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not large, standard letter size. Creased once down the middle. "I'm sure Daniel here knows about her spending habits," he said lightly. "The renovation project in 2014? The one that went 20% over?" My breath paused. That project had been a joint venture. Marcus knew that. He'd signed off on half the decisions. But he framed it differently now. Singular. Personal. He looked at Daniel. You might want to keep an eye on that." A few heads turned toward my husband, and then, as if the script required a punchline, Marcus flicked the dollar bill toward me. "Contribution," he said, "for the venue upgrade." It landed near my shoes, not dramatically, just a soft, papery whisper against fabric. In that moment, something inside me crystallized. Not fury, not humiliation, recognition. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was about narrative control. Marcus had built his identity around being the successful one, the elevated one. If I stood there in a modest art hall, marrying quietly, happily, that disrupted his storyline. So he adjusted the scene to restore his role, antagonist disguised as benefactor. I want to pause here because this part matters. If you've ever had someone rewrite your history in public, subtly, with half-truths, you know how destabilizing that can feel. It's not the accusation itself, it's the framing, the selective memory, and I'd genuinely like to know, how do you hold your ground when someone edits your story in real time? Because I had seconds to decide. The folded paper in his hand caught my eye again. I noticed a logo in the corner, my former company's letterhead. Except, no, not former. I still consulted occasionally. My pulse shifted. That paper wasn't random. Marcus worked closely with several development firms in the city. He had influence, connections, contracts. And suddenly, the pieces aligned in a way that made my jaw tighten. This wasn't just mockery. It was leverage. He hadn't come only to embarrass me. He'd come to imply instability, to cast doubt on my professional competence in front of witnesses, some of whom were colleagues. My throat felt dry, but my mind sharpened. I realized something else then. Something I hadn't considered. Before that second, Marcus didn't know about Daniel's full position in the city's development network. Most people didn't. Daniel operated quietly. Investments structured through holding companies, partnerships layered, public presence minimal. Marcus thought he was stepping into a modest gathering to expose his ex-wife's downgrade. He didn't realize he was standing in a room largely financed by the man beside me. The weight of that irony pressed against my ribs, and here, this is hard to admit, a small part of me felt tired, not devastated, not broken, just exhausted by the predictability of it, of him. For years, I'd questioned whether leaving Marcus had been impulsive, whether I'd misjudged, whether I'd overreacted to small corrections and subtle condescension. Standing there, watching him weaponize a wedding, I felt the last thread of doubt dissolve. This was who he was, and this was who I no longer belonged to. The lowest point wasn't the dollar. It wasn't the laughter. It was the realization that he had probably planned this for days, printed that letter, practiced that tone, driven here intending to chip at my credibility. That knowledge settled heavy in my chest. And for a brief, quiet second, one I haven't told many people about, I wondered if staying silent would be strength. Or surrender. I didn't bend down to pick up the dollar. That was the first decision. Small, visible, intentional. It stayed there near the hem of my dress, slightly curled at one corner from where it hit the floor. I could see George Washington's face tilted sideways. For a strange second, I focused on that instead of Marcus. Details steady you. Daniel's thumb brushed the inside of my wrist once, a question without words. I inhaled slowly through my nose. The room smelled faintly of buttercream frosting and something metallic, maybe the mic stand warming under the lights. My heartbeat wasn't racing the way I expected. It felt measured. Marcus was still holding that folded paper. He thought he had introduced uncertainty. He didn't realize. He had clarified something instead. I leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered, "Let me handle this." My voice sounded calm. That surprised me. I thought it might crack. He studied my face for half a second. Then he nodded. Once. Support without interference. That was new to me. I turned fully toward Marcus. Not abruptly. No drama. Just a shift of shoulders and eye contact. The guests followed the movement like a current. You came prepared, I said evenly. Not loud. Not soft. He smiled as if we were sharing a private joke. I believe in due diligence. There it was again. The boardroom language. I stepped away from Daniel, only one step, creating space that was mine alone. I remember thinking I should have worn lower heels because the concrete floor felt uneven. Or maybe it wasn't uneven. Maybe it was just my balance adjusting. Funny what your brain fixates on. I extended my hand toward the folded paper. May I? He hesitated, briefly. That flicker was almost invisible, but I saw it. Then he handed it over. The paper felt thicker than standard printer stock. He'd chosen heavier weight. Intentional. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't an accusation. Exactly. It was a financial summary of the 2014 project, selectively highlighting budget overruns without noting shared approvals. Numbers boxed in red, margins circled. It was technically accurate, but strategically incomplete. I let the silence stretch after reading it, not for theatrics, for alignment. Then I looked up. Marcus, I said, and I made sure my tone carried. If you're concerned about financial management, this may not be the room for that conversation. A few guests shifted. Someone cleared their throat. He tilted his head slightly. Transparency benefits everyone. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Here's where the planning crystallized. Not weeks of plotting, not revenge. Just clarity about outcome. Marcus wanted doubt. He wanted me defensive. He wanted Daniel evaluating. So I chose the opposite direction. I turned slightly toward the guests instead of Marcus. For anyone here who has worked with me, I said, you know that project completed under revised scope and has since generated steady returns. That was true. I didn't elaborate. I didn't justify. I stated. Then I added, and for those who haven't, I'm happy to discuss spreadsheets another day. A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room. Control is often quiet. Marcus's jaw tightened just slightly. Not enough for most to notice. I stepped back toward Daniel's side. Not hiding. Recentering. And then Daniel did something I hadn't anticipated. He stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not with raised voice. Just a shift in posture that carried weight. He buttoned his suit jacket, a small, deliberate motion. Marcus, he said evenly, I appreciate your concern. That sentence landed differently coming from him. He paused. Just enough. But if we're discussing investments, Daniel continued, you might want to check the latest acquisition reports from your own firm. Marcus blinked. Only once. The room felt suddenly smaller. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply added, specifically the Midtown redevelopment contract, the one finalized last quarter. There was a silence that didn't feel ceremonial anymore. It felt sharp. I knew about that contract. Not in detail. Actually, no. I did know some details. Daniel had mentioned an acquisition but hadn't named the firm publicly. I hadn't connected it to Marcus's portfolio until that moment. Marcus's company had recently lost a major bid to an anonymous holding group, Daniel's holding group. I believe, Daniel said calmly, that makes today an interesting day to throw dollar bills. There was no smile on his face. Marcus's expression shifted. Subtle. The confidence thinned. I realized then that Daniel hadn't reacted impulsively. He had recognized Marcus immediately, assessed him, chosen his timing. He hadn't stood earlier because he didn't need to. That awareness moved through me slowly. I hadn't married rescue. I had married partnership. And here's where I want to ask something that may divide opinions. When someone publicly disrespects you, is it stronger to respond directly or to let consequences speak? Because in that moment, both were unfolding. Marcus looked at me, then at Daniel, then at the guests. The room no longer leaned toward him. The energy had shifted. He cleared his throat. "I see," he said lightly. But the Polish had dulled. The dollar still lay near my dress. I bent down then, not quickly, and picked it up. I walked the few steps toward him and held it out. "You forgot your change," I said. Not cruel, not triumphant, just final. And as I stepped back to Daniel's side, I felt something settle inside me. Not adrenaline, not victory, alignment. The officiant, bless her steady heart, cleared her throat and resumed the ceremony. And this time, when she asked if anyone objected, no one stood. The room didn't exhale all at once. It released in pieces. A chair leg scraped. Someone coughed. My cousin muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath. The officiant blinked twice, then lifted her folder like a shield and said, "Shall we continue?" "Yes," I said. Simple. Marcus didn't sit down immediately. He stood there half a second too long, as if calculating whether another line might recover the moment. His fingers adjusted his cufflinks. A habit. He used to do that before big presentations. Daniel didn't look at him again. That was deliberate. The officiant resumed, her voice steadier now. The script moved forward. Rings, promises, breath. I heard my own pulse in my ears for a few seconds. No, not seconds. Probably just one. It stretched. Marcus finally stepped backward. One step, then another. He didn't turn his back right. Away. He held eye contact with me as if trying to locate some crack in my expression. He didn't find one. He pivoted. The door opened. Closed. No slam. Just the metallic click of a latch catching. And just like that, he was gone. The ceremony continued. Daniel slid the ring onto my finger. His hands were warm, steady. Mine were too. I'd expected a tremor. There wasn't one. "I do," I said. "Clear." When Daniel said it back, his voice didn't waver. Not even slightly. The officiant pronounced us married. Applause broke out. Uneven at first, then full. Real. My sister wiped under her eye with the back of her hand. My uncle clapped too loudly, as he always does. The cake table wobbled when someone leaned against it. Life resumed. That's the strange part. Moments that feel explosive inside you barely alter the furniture. We walked back down the aisle together. I could feel eyes on us, not pitying, curious, protective, proud. It's hard to categorize. Daniel leaned close and whispered, "You okay?" "Yes," I said. Then, after a beat, "Are you?" He huffed a quiet breath, almost a laugh. Perfectly, at the reception, people circled carefully at first, testing the atmosphere. My aunt pressed a champagne flute into my hand. "To resilience," she said softly. I almost corrected her, because it hadn't felt like resilience. It had felt like clarity, but I let it go. Across the room, I noticed two of my former colleagues speaking in low tones. One glanced toward the door Marcus had exited through, then toward Daniel, then back at me. Information was recalibrating. Daniel's phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. He didn't check it immediately. That detail stays with me. He waited until he had set down his drink and stepped slightly aside. He read the screen, a small nod, nothing dramatic. Later, much later, I learned that one of Marcus's senior partners had texted him mid-ceremony. Apparently, someone in the room had quietly informed them about the interruption. Word travels fast in certain circles. Marcus had misjudged the audience. He thought he was addressing a small, modest gathering. He hadn't accounted for overlap. Want to acknowledge something here because I know some of you might be thinking it. This could have escalated. It could have turned ugly. Voices raised, security called. A scene that overshadowed the marriage itself. And maybe some people would argue that I should have thrown him out immediately, or that Daniel should have confronted him harder. Public humiliation for public humiliation. I understand that instinct. But here's what actually happened. We cut the cake. We danced. The DJ, who was really my cousin's friend with a playlist, played an old R&B track that Daniel loves. He cannot dance, not smoothly. He tries. It's endearing. At one point, he spun me too fast and I stumbled slightly. No, I didn't stumble. I misstepped. He caught my elbow before I tipped. We laughed, not forced, not defiant, just present. Marcus didn't return. The dollar bill sat on the gift table for most of the evening. Someone must have moved it there. I didn't notice when. Later, my sister tucked it into my purse without saying a word. Outside, the sky turned that dusty blue just before full dark. The brick walls reflected soft amber light from the string bulbs overhead. People gathered in small clusters. Conversations resumed their normal volume. If you'd walked in an hour later, you wouldn't have known anything had happened, but something had. Inside me, a chapter had sealed, not dramatically, quietly. When we finally left, Daniel held the car, door open for me. I paused before getting in and looked back at the hall. I half expected to see Marcus standing across the street. He wasn't. Just a stray paper cup near the curb. Rolling slightly in the breeze, that was it. The climax people expected, shouting, revenge, collapse, never came. What came instead was something steadier. He had tried to shrink me in public and failed, completely. The next morning was quiet. Not symbolic quiet, just actual quiet. The kind that comes after guests leave and the refrigerator hum is the loudest thing in the room. We stayed at a small hotel downtown. Nothing extravagant. Brick walls again. Apparently I have a theme. And heavy curtains that blocked out most of the light. I woke up before Daniel did. My dress hung over a chair in the corner, the hem slightly wrinkled. For a second, I forgot. Then I saw the crease where the dollar had landed. Memory returned in pieces. Not sharp, just layered. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the faucet. The pipes rattled briefly before the water steadied. I watched it run over my fingers, cool and clear. My reflection looked normal, a little tired, mascara faintly smudged under one eye. Not devastated. That surprised me. Daniel stirred behind me. "You're up early," he said, voice thick with sleep. "Habit," I replied. We didn't dissect the wedding immediately. We talked about breakfast, about whether the coffee downstairs would be any good, about returning the rental speakers. Ordinary logistics. There was something healing in that. Later, while he showered, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my purse. My sister had tucked the dollar bill into the inner pocket, folded neatly now. I smoothed it flat on my palm. Paper. Ink, nothing mystical about it. For a moment, I considered throwing it away, dropping it in the hotel trash and being done with it. Instead, I slipped it back into my wallet. Not as a trophy, not as a wound, as a reminder. Here's where the aftermath unfolded, and it wasn't explosive. Over the next week, I received 3 separate emails from colleagues who had attended, each one carefully worded, professional. If you ever need clarification provided to any parties, or just to confirm, The 2014 project documentation reflects shared authorization. They were aligning publicly.
Marcus's attempt to cast doubt had triggered verification instead. Daniel never gloated. Not once. When I mentioned the Midtown contract, he shrugged lightly. Business cycles, he said. But I noticed something else. Marcus stopped contacting mutual partners about me. Stopped sending the occasional pointed article link. Stopped the background noise. Silence can be information. About 2 weeks later, I heard, through someone who probably shouldn't have told me, that Marcus had been quietly edged out of a leadership position. Not fired. Not publicly removed. Just repositioned. I don't know how much of that was connected to the wedding incident. Maybe none. Maybe some. Corporate politics is layered. I won't pretend I have full visibility. What I do know is this: he misjudged leverage. And that miscalculation cost him credibility. There is a difference between appearing powerful and being secure. I learned that the hard way years ago. Sitting on our condo balcony one evening, the maple tree shedding leaves again, I asked myself something uncomfortable. Would I have responded the same way if Daniel hadn't had that business advantage? If he'd just been a schoolteacher? Or a mechanic? Or anyone without financial influence? I want to believe yes. But I can't answer that with absolute certainty. Because part of my steadiness came from knowing Marcus no longer held structural power over my life. That matters. And it's okay to admit it matters. If you've ever confronted someone who once controlled your environment, your income, your social circle, your narrative, you understand how different it feels when that control is gone. Would I act the same again? I think so. No, let me rephrase that. I would aim to. But courage sometimes leans on context. Daniel joined me on the balcony that evening. He rested his forearms on the railing, watching the parking lot below. You know, he said quietly, I almost stepped in sooner. I know, I replied. He glanced at me. You didn't need me to. That wasn't pride. It was recognition. I leaned my head lightly against his shoulder. The metal railing felt cool against my wrists. What was lost that day? Any remaining illusion that Marcus and I could someday occupy neutral space. What endured? My voice. What changed permanently? The way I understood self-respect. Not as volume. As alignment. I don't hate Marcus. That's important to say. I see him clearly now. And clarity doesn't require rage. Sometimes it just requires distance. The dollar bill is still in my wallet. Tucked behind my driver's license. Not because it hurts. Because it doesn't. That's the point. There's one more thing I haven't said yet. About a month after the wedding, I ran into Marcus at a fundraising event. Not one of his usual grand galas, this was smaller. Community-focused. Folding tables again. Funny how that works. He saw me before I saw him. For a split second, and I mean a flicker, I wondered if he'd approach with another performance. Another polished remark. But he didn't. He nodded. Just that. No smirk. No commentary about venues or budgets. His suit was still immaculate. His posture still upright. But there was something different in the way he held eye contact. Shorter. Less certain. I nodded back. And we both kept walking. Closure rarely arrives with speeches. It arrives in reduced tension. In neutral body language. In the absence of provocation. I used to believe that strength meant overpowering someone who tried to diminish you. Meeting force with force. Matching tone for tone. Now I think strength is quieter. It's choosing not to inherit someone else's insecurity. It's refusing to audition for a role in a story you've already left. When Marcus threw that dollar, he was trying to reduce my worth to optics. To suggest that value lives in chandeliers and square footage and guest lists. But value doesn't echo in marble floors. It lives in steadiness. And here's something I'm still working through, because growth isn't a finished product. Part of me once wanted him to regret losing me. I won't pretend that impulse never existed. It did. It lingered longer than I'd like to admit. But regret is a fragile currency. Self-respect is sturdier. If I've learned anything, it's that humiliation only lands if you agree to carry it. I didn't carry it that day. Daniel didn't rescue me. He didn't dominate the room. He stood beside me. And when he spoke, he didn't defend my ego, he defended truth. That difference matters. We celebrated our first anniversary quietly last week. Same condo. Same balcony. The maple tree is taller now. Or maybe I just notice it more. Time does that, stretches trees and compresses memory. I took the dollar out of my wallet that night. I almost threw it away again. Then I paused. Not because I still feel something raw about it. But because it reminds me of a question I want to leave with you. When someone tries to define your worth in public, to shrink you, to frame you, to reduce you, what do you choose to carry afterward? Their version? Or your own alignment? There isn't a single right answer. Some people confront loudly. Some walk away. Some fight. Some forgive. All of those choices carry consequences. But here's the open-ended part, and I genuinely mean this. Do you believe forgiveness requires reconciliation? Or can it simply mean releasing someone's grip on your self-definition? I don't think there's one universal formula. I only know what worked for me. That day in the art hall, under string lights and humming speakers, I realized something simple and unshakable. A person who needs to mock your stability is announcing their own. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Camera's voice travels. Your worth is not negotiable just because someone else mispriced it.